Hello, everyone. I am doing a little bit of a recording today to introduce to you this process of data analysis. We're going to spend a lot of time this week looking at the idea of coding and what that looks like and what that means. Okay, so you're going to see that there's a series of articles, there's a series of documents in PDF, there's a series of videos that talk about the idea of coding as a key element of data collection. Right? So we spent some time more toward the beginning of the semester thinking about how do we collect some of this information. We tried to do a research together. We learned about methods. We also did an interview, right? You also doing observations in the psychology class. So we have some information on how we interact with people and how we can possibly collect some data. So obviously there's a lot more there's other ways of doing this, and in the complexities of each of these interviews, there are semi-structured, there are structured, there's observations that they are organized in different ways. We can have focus groups, we can have other things, and we'll continue to talk about them a little bit in the forthcoming weeks. But one of the important things is what we do when we collect all this data. So I want you to take a look, for instance, there's an interesting video here in the layout for the class this week that talks about collecting data and organizing data through software. And you're going to see in that video is connected to something called NVivo. There's various different kinds of softwares. I used NVivo before, continue to use it actually to this day, and I think it's very helpful. And you're going to see as you click on the link that it starts by playing all the kinds of data that you can collect, right? You can collect something that you wrote, a transcription of an interview, for instance, or you can have documents. You can have things that you collected from websites, for instance, text, those kinds of things. You can have images. You can have sound, right? So audio files, you can also have video files, and all that. It's compiled together we could do that obviously by hand, so to speak, by having this all in front of us, but we can also do that via software. What's interesting is that it shows not only that, how we can collect all these forms of data. As if, you doing your own research in your classroom, for instance, you might have data that comes from student work. You can have data that comes from interview. You can have data there in form of a survey, or you can have data in form of a series of tests that you do with the students. You can have data in form of videos, data in form of, collective interviews, of all kinds of things, right? We all know about that. Now, how do we organize, how do we make sense of this all? Is the key element of the analysis. Like part of our literature review that we're developing is a sense of figuring out what is a theoretical framework, right? And the theoretical framework, and we talked about this before, is that kind of structure, right, the thoughtful structure that is behind all the kinds of things that you're doing. For instance, in the example that I sent out for the introduction the other day is based on Ari Nemzer's thesis, and the theoretical framework for his look into the notion of the you know, summer camps, summer camps is the idea of a community of practice. Well, there's a lot of people that have written about the concept of community of practice, and that concept is one in which that a particular environment, when formed and when kind of supported by very specific ways, forms something that helps students, that generates motivation, that helps students to understand, that produces models for them, so that generates a community of practice that helps learning, growth, so forth and so on. That's a theoretical framework. Jacobo, when he's looking at the issue of El Sistema and the GMO, his theoretical framework is the idea of participative literacy, so that the literacy happens differently, right? We learn and we know that we know something when we engage with each other. Well, that's the theoretical framework. All of you are finding this out as you work on your literature review, and as, later on, as we're going to develop your capstones or thesis, we're going to focus on that theoretical framework, right? All this is to say that that theoretical framework helps us then to make judgments about not only what is important of all this data that we collected, but also how I might organize the data collection. All right. So you see in some of the PDFs, for instance, that I have, one of them shows a text, right? And the text is all kind of marked as if I have been looking at your work, right? But the purpose of all those markings is, of course, to highlight what are the kinds of things that are really significant. And by highlighting, I connect them to things that were part of my literature review, things that I saw in the literature review. I connect them to the sense of a theoretical framework, right? To this idea of what it is that if I'm talking about assessment, what it is that I want to say about assessment, or I want to connect to this issue of something that is personal, or I'm talking about appreciation, so I'm thinking about popular music and informality, or I'm talking about information technology, so right? So I'm starting to pay attention to those things, and then I start taking parts out of the data that I collected. I saw a video, I observed something, and I wrote it down. In my interview, the people talk about this issue. And I start making marks, I start coding this, I start organizing this in some way that provides me with themes, right? Provides me with larger ideas that I can then start grouping different kinds of data to really build later on what was going to be connected, what's going to be talked about, something that we named triangulation, which will help us to create something that is valid, right? With the idea of validity, which we will talk about next week. So all these are concepts and things that you're going to see throughout the presentation. Creswell in chapter 9, which we're going to go back and kind of review that and write a little bit in one of the assignments, talks about that. Then I also offered for you this week a chapter by Lucy Green where she talks about how popular musicians learn. And I organized that, and you can see that on Blackboard, that there's different parts of what she does. She presents an introduction, just as I had been suggesting you do with the literature review and your intro and so forth and so on. And then she actually talks about the themes, her ideas, her concepts, right? And then she links them to the literature review. Then she brings a little bit of her voice, what she's going to do, and then you see all those, she calls different stages of how these popular musicians learn. But now she infuses them with data, which means she puts the voices of the kids that she worked with and she interviewed and she observed now to really warrant, to support, right? To really offer something that is convincing, which is the key point here, right? So that what she thought she saw, what she is suggesting at these stages that all students go through when they're trying to learn popular music in an informal way. Now she uses the voices of the kids that she interviewed, that she spent time with, that she observed, to support that idea, right? So part of that process in one of the other PDFs that you're going to see is on organization. There's things that happen at the same time, simultaneously. I look at this and I look at all these things at the same time, right? So I think back at the literature review. I think of my purpose in my research questions. I think about this theoretical framework, right? But there's also other elements that are iterative. So I read something in the literature review, and then I go and I collect the data, and then I go back, there's something really interesting there, but I didn't really have anything that connects to my literature review. So I go back and I search for other things, and then I say, ooh, how does this connect maybe with my, my research questions? And then I go back and I see, ooh, there's another thing that I haven't thought, but this is, so this is the iterative process. So I keep on going back and forth between all these levels, trying to organize the data, seeing if I have sufficient data, and then trying to organize this in a convincing way, right? And that all this process, collecting from different data sources, organizing the process well, articulating, linking to the literature review, all this forms the validity of the study. Okay, so please take a look at all these elements, all the videos, all the materials here, and then you have 3 assignments to do. One assignment is something that's going to continue between now and the end, which is the last one, which is constantly adding 2 articles yourself, right, for your to your literature review. You're going to add, you're going to put that in red, and you're going to send it to me. And then you have the other assignments there for this week. On Wednesday, producing a video when you're looking, reading of these ideas, going back to Creswell, now linking to Green, and producing a small video like this one, of about 3 to 5 minutes, right? And then a PowerPoint for Saturday, where all this data, all this information, you're going to have to make sense of all this data. And this can be done in a pairing, right? You can do that with a partner. Okay, so I hope that helps you to kind of frame and think about all these issues, and now go to all the materials, read them carefully, and if you have questions and issues, of course, send them back to me.